Thanks very much, and thank you for the kind introduction. So I'm very honored to be here. This is a beautiful building, and I just had a bit of a tour, and I'm very impressed. One of the reasons I'm impressed with Riwaq actually is because my research in South Africa has focused quite a bit on architecture and urban planning. And so I'll talk a little bit about that today, since I know that maybe many of you are interested in that kind of field. What I want to talk a bit about today is the apartheid analogy. But I want to get at it by focusing mostly on an argument about how apartheid worked in South Africa that I think is largely left out of the discourse on the apartheid analogy. So as I know, the apartheid analogy has become very common among analysts. It's central to the BDS movement. It's ubiquitous in the slogans and signs that we see in pro-Palestinian rallies around the world. And people often use the term apartheid to describe things in Israel, Palestine, like the separation wall, Israel's annexation of the most valuable land and resources in Palestine. They use apartheid to describe the race-based ID system, the proliferation of checkpoints, Israeli-only roads, and other facets of the occupation that resemble apartheid South Africa. And of course, Israel officially refutes the apartheid analogy on the basis that these policies operate only within Gaza and the West Bank, which are technically not part of Israel and are controlled by independent governments. Okay. So within Israel proper, they say, no such discrimination exists. And indeed, the state officially prohibits discrimination on the basis of race and religion. This is the claim. So there may be deep racial tension in the country, they say, but there are no laws that prevent Arab citizens from using the same buses or beaches as Jews use. And both Arabs and Jewish citizens have equal right to vote. So of course we know that this is not entirely true. There are a number of laws that actually do discriminate on the basis of race, like the law of return, which allows foreign Jews to immigrate freely and gain citizenship, while denying this right to Arabs who were displaced during 48 and 67. And the citizenship law of 2003, as we know, renders Arabs ineligible for residency rights that are normally granted to people who marry Israeli citizens. And then, of course, there are many forms of de facto discrimination. Jewish citizens, as we know, receive better education on the whole and higher salaries than Arab citizens do. And the poverty rate for Jewish citizens is very low, whereas the poverty rate for Arab citizens is around 50%. But Israel contends that the same could be said of African Americans in the United States. So this is a problem of social inequality, they say, and not a question of apartheid. But I think that Israel's position in this debate is very instructive and illuminates quite a bit. It reveals a kernel truth about their strategy. Apartheid is an international crime, but Israelis avoid this accusation by shifting the question of race into a question of nationality. So in 1967, David Ben-Gurion himself stated that avoiding the allegation of apartheid would require that Israel, quote, rid itself of the territories and their Arab population as soon as possible. So the move to grant self-government to the West Bank and Gaza has been a step in this kind of direction. So ironically, however, I want to argue that it is here that the apartheid analogy really gains its traction. The characteristic of Israeli policy that most resembles the logic of apartheid is not its immigration laws or its checkpoints or the ID system or even the wall, but rather the very fact that it seeks to displace the question of racial discrimination by shifting national borders. Okay? So this was a core strategy of the apartheid state, and indeed we might even say that it was central to the logic of colonialism itself, not just in South Africa, but across the continent. So how exactly did apartheid in South Africa operate? I think this question is actually not asked often enough. When most people think about apartheid, they think about the laws that classified people by racial group, and then segregated beaches and buses and benches and trains and parks and toilets, hospitals, schools, and other public services and spaces. Hey, can I just have a glass of water? Yeah. So many also recall that the apartheid state prohibited marriage between races, and that a color bar ensured that Africans could never access higher paying employments. Okay, and of course Africans were denied representation in a unified parliament. So these discriminatory laws that we're familiar with were known as, thank you very much, were known as petty apartheid. And there's no question, of course, that black people experienced these laws as devastating and often violent on an everyday level. But it's important to understand that these laws were in fact superficial compared to the vision of grand apartheid that lay at the core of the state's strategy. So grand apartheid was much more than just simply racial discrimination. It was an organized and highly efficient system of political control and economic exploitation. So I want to give you a sense for how grand apartheid works in South Africa. And the best way is to think about this issue from the perspective of the colonizers themselves. Right? So British colonizers in South Africa in the 19th century faced a serious conundrum. They were a minority white population, and they had to figure out how to control the much larger, significantly larger black population that inhabited the country's vast rural areas. Okay, and they had to do that as inexpensively as possible because they didn't have a lot of resources. So they had a few problems they were facing. The first problem was if you were to rule the black population directly through military occupation or through an entrenched state bureaucracy, it would require a commitment of resources that the colonial administration was simply unable to afford. White people were only about 10% of the population, so quite small. And also, if you ruled directly, then Africans would experience the everyday humiliation of being under occupation by white colonizers, right? Now, this would probably spark waves of resistance that would easily overwhelm minority rule, okay? So again, you have to remember that Africans were a massive majority in the country, and so if they were facing this kind of direct colonization, there would be very aggressive resistance. So the white population was afraid of that and sought to manage it. And their solution was to costume colonial power behind the facade of a native authority. Okay? So what they did is the strategy was effectively this: to buy off local chiefs in rural areas by putting them on the colonial payroll. So this is a way of effectively outsourcing the occupation to already accepted forms of native authority. And it was very cheap to do so, much cheaper to put existing chiefs on the payroll than to pay colonial authorities to be established there. So, and they also, if there were places where there was no suitably subservient chief in place, then they would often install their own. Okay, and in places that had no chiefs, then they would create a chieftaincy. This is very common across rural South Africa. They also inscribed a system of customary law that would rule in these rural areas. And the idea was that customary law would grant chiefs and local authorities extra patriarchal powers.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Don't worry about it. That's fine. That's fine. Yeah. So it was a bargain with local patriarchs. You can think of it that way.
Sorry, would you mind just repeating what you just last said?
Yeah, so I was saying that in addition to buying off existing chiefs and installing new chiefs where no suitably subservient chiefs were available, they would also use they imposed a system of customary law that effectively gave chiefs and patriarchs additional powers that they didn't enjoy under the traditional system. Okay, so they bolstered the power of patriarchs, be they chiefs or fathers of families or clan elders. And again, these were not traditional powers they enjoyed, they were given to them by the colonial system. So it was a kind of a bargain with the patriarchs. The idea was that if you give patriarchs new powers, then they'll buy into your system, and they'll effectively control women and youth on your behalf. Okay? So it was a very effective way of sort of pushing control through the system. So, and this is interesting because a lot of the stereotypes that people have about so-called traditional African society is that they're highly patriarchal, et cetera, and give women very, very minority rights. And in fact, research in South Africa shows that this was not true of pre-colonial African society to the extent that it was during colonialism. Okay, so a lot of these stereotypes actually come from a system of colonial power that was imposed according to sort of white fantasies of what African society should look like. Okay, so the idea was that Africans would be much less likely to question the authority of their own elders than they would an obvious foreign power. This tactic was known as indirect rule, and it provided a semblance of legitimacy to white power by disguising it behind a black mask. So it was a more effective method of political control and much cheaper than direct rule would have been. Okay. Okay, so this approach began in the late 1800s and was expanded with the Natives Land Act of 1913. So this is the next step in indirect rule, and it was the cornerstone of grand apartheid. the Natives Land Act decreed that Africans could only own land in designated native reserves, okay, is how they were called. So this is a fragmented set of marginal and resource-poor territories that comprised only about 13% of the total land mass in South Africa. So remember, so Africans were 90% of the population, and they were pushed into effectively 13% of the land mass. So this map shows the various native reserves that were designated by the apartheid state, which are color-coded by putative ethnicity. Okay, so they were organized by ethnicity, which is of course a false organization, again imposed by colonial rule. And what's key to understand here is that it was highly fragmented. So you have 260 islands of native reserves. They were not contiguous in most cases, and the reason is because white colonizers wanted to claim the best land that was closest to the best resources and the rivers and the best roads. And everything else, the marginal land, was left to the reserves. Okay? So and this is crucial because people were literally, I mean, it's difficult to imagine this today, literally picked up and put in trucks and then dumped in native reserves, even if they had never lived there before, on the basis that you speak the same language as the people we put in that reserve, so you're going there. So it was a really profoundly violent and destructive process. And also it was a monumental land grab. And to justify it, the state claimed that the reserves approximated the locations of indigenous homelands, ethnic homelands. And this spatial and ethnic division was very useful as like a divide and rule tactic. So it created ethnic conflict that prevented the rise of a unified black national consciousness. Okay? And that was the purpose of it. So it helped prevent resistance against the occupation. Now, but of course there was a problem with this kind of strict segregation. So Europeans needed African labor to work on their farms and their mines and their factories. So Europeans had a massive labor shortage, and they called this the labor question. So it was not possible for the white economy to develop without cheap black labor. Okay? And they knew that. So to solve that problem, colonial administrators had to figure out a way to get labor to come into their economy. And they developed a system of internal migration. Right? So the idea here was that Africans would basically support themselves primarily through subsistence agriculture in the reserves. But if subsistence was too successful in the reserves, that would be a problem, right? Because then Africans would just be happy staying there, presumably. I mean, according to the administrators. They'd have no reason to leave the reserves and seek wage work in the white economy. So the colonizers had to figure out a way to get them to leave the reserves and come into the white economy. And there were two primary tactics they used. One was to impose taxes, and this basically meant that in order to pay the taxes and avoid going to jail from non-payment, you had to work in the white economy and use your wages to pay taxes. And the second tactic was even more devious. It was to control the inputs that were necessary for effective subsistence farming, like land and water. So the idea was to sabotage the agricultural sector just enough so that it would not be sufficient for subsistence. So you would force people into the industrial labor market. And it came down basically to calorie counting. And so it's very similar actually to the tactics that Israel has used with Gaza, controlling calories across the border. So the idea is that then when African workers are in the white economy, you pay them very low wages, so they can't support their families on wages alone, right? And this means that they have to rely on subsistence activities in the reserves in order to survive, in order for their families to survive. So the system worked by sabotaging both ends of the spectrum. You sabotage wages in the industrial area, forcing people into the reserves. You sabotage the reserves' agricultural capacity and force people into the industrial labor market. So it was a kind of intentional cynical equilibrium between these two poles. But of course, the system was also supported by force through the use of limited work permits and pass laws. So these are known in South Africa as influx controls, trying to figure out ways to control the influx of the black population into white areas. So women and children in the early part of apartheid were prohibited from entering white areas. Men were allowed to enter white areas, but only if they had work permits, okay, so passes, that were signed by white employers for a specified period of time, no longer than a year. And after the year is over, you have to be ejected back to the reserves until you get another employment contract, okay? So your rights to access the city are entirely contingent on your employment by white employers. So Africans became like migrants in their own country, effectively. And there were very rigorous checkpoints, police checkpoints that that manage the flow of people around the country. And if you were ever found without a pass, without a valid pass, you'd be put in prison and then ejected back to the reserves. Again, usually with dump trucks. Okay. So maybe this is familiar to many of you, but the point I want to make here is that this system came with enormous economic benefits to the white population. It allowed Europeans to pay African workers what they called a bachelor wage. So the idea was that their wages were never enough to support families. They were only enough to support single men. So think about it. Normally, if you pay a worker wages, you have to pay them enough so that they can reproduce themselves through their families. And so you have workers to use in the future. Okay? But in this system,
they will manage.
They'll manage you over there.
Sorry.
No worries. Oh, that's okay. Don't worry. Please, I have no problem. So normally you would have to pay workers enough to reproduce themselves, but in this system you didn't have to do that. So the reproduction of labor was supported through the subsistence activities in the rural reserves, which was conducted mostly by women. Okay. So basically, extra cheap wages for African men in white areas were subsidized by unpaid female labor in the native reserves. Right. So this meant that colonizers could make use of black labor without having to pay the costs of reproducing that labor. So in addition, the state didn't have to pay any welfare for workers in the native reserves. So once workers' bodies were used up by the labor process, or if they became disabled or sick or old, they could simply be ejected back to the native reserves, where the cost of caring for them would not be borne by the state, but rather by women and children in the reserves. Okay? So again, under normal circumstances, if you employ a worker, you have to supply some kind of welfare system. In this case, the state removed that responsibility from itself. Okay, so that cost was cut entirely. So this led to unspeakably huge profits in South Africa for the white community. So white South Africans had the highest standards of living in the world at the time. The massive development of the white economy in South Africa depended ultimately on the super exploitation of black labor. Okay. So the best way to think about this system is as a machine that effectively pumped value out of the reserves and into the white economy. So in other words, value in the form of labor would be produced in the reserves for free, and then you would pump that out, into the colonial system. So the reserves were called land reserves, and we often think of them that way. But in fact, they were labor reserves, reproducing labor to be used in the colonial economy. Another major benefit of this system was that it was almost as though the colonizers had read Karl Marx. So Marx had this theory that once you proletarianize a population, then they develop a sort of class consciousness, and that's the basis for their resistance against capitalism. Now, what the colonizers wanted to do was proletarianize people, but not fully. Keep them tied to rural areas, and that way they'll never develop a sufficient class consciousness to resist capitalism. And that was an explicit goal. So, and of course, the system of grand apartheid was justified under a number of registers. To most white people, it was justified on the basis of drumming up fears about racial mixing and racial pollution. Okay, so what's clear here is that theories of racial inferiority were developed actively to support this system of exploitation, to justify this system of exploitation, not the other way around. And this is so important to understand. So the point is that segregation in South Africa is not primarily about race, it's about labor, and race was the justification for it. So to liberals in the international community, this system was justified as a humanitarian system, as a way of preserving tribal life in the reserves. And it was called by the benign-sounding term separate development. I'm sure you've heard this term before. So the claim was that in these native reserves, Africans could live by their own cultural values and pursue their own ends without interference from white overlords. It sounds great to the international community who doesn't know what's going on here. It sounds great. Let them have their own space and they can be who they want to be. Very persuasive rhetoric. Okay. I wanted to talk a bit about, just make one quick theoretical point without being academic at all, hopefully. So standard development theory has always held that the history of capitalist development always requires the destruction of the peasant mode of production. Okay, so you want to force peasants off the land, claim the land for yourselves, and then permanently push them into the labor market. Okay, full proletarianization. So if you think about like the enclosure movement in Europe and the genocide of Native Americans in the U.S., I mean, it's clear that in those cases, total eradication of the peasant population was the goal. Okay, and of course now there's no peasants left in the U.S. and in Europe. And everybody thought that theorists thought the same process would apply under colonialism. But in fact, that didn't happen. So colonialism developed as a form of capitalism that specifically sought to maintain the peasant sector in the interest of capitalist development. Okay, does that kind of make sense? You don't want to destroy it entirely. It's more profitable to maintain it and then pump it of its substance. So these peasant reserves became more profitable than gold and diamond mines in South Africa because they constantly reproduced labor that could be used cheaply in the economy. So it's like the goose that laid the golden egg. It just keeps producing value for you. Right? You don't want to kill that goose. That was kind of their theory. And this was a very intentional policy on the part of the colonizers. Oh, I've got some great slides I want to show you. I'll just take a bit of a break and show you these slides here. So when African, tipping over. So when African workers were, that's fine, I'll survive. When African workers were in urban areas, then they were housed in labor hostels. Okay, they were not allowed to own houses for the most part in urban areas. And this is an example of a labor hostel in South Africa. So you can see that for those of you interested in sort of spatial analysis, it's very clearly laid out as a panopticon. So a central guard tower in the very middle is able to see pretty much all of the labor hostel entryways, and so you can control the laboring population very effectively in these compounds. I mean, high systems of surveillance and control. Here's another example, and mind you, these still exist today. These have not been abolished; they're still used. It's crazy. I took these from Google Maps just a few weeks ago. That's another example. Again, you see the panopticon organization of space. This is what conditions were like in many of the labor hostels. As you can see, they were treated basically just like, like laboring bodies, not like humans, right? So towards the later apartheid period, we did see the acceptance that you couldn't remove the entire black population from the towns, right? And so what happened was they segregated towns themselves. And so in most South African industrial areas, you would have a white town, and then right next to the white town, you'd have a black township. So this is a contemporary example. I'm okay, I think. Yeah, thanks. This is a contemporary example. And you see this segregation still exists today. I don't know if you can guess which one is the white town and which one is the black town. The white town is on the right with the nice green spaces. The one that's incredibly densely populated is on the left. So in most areas around mines, you'll see something similar to this. Once the apartheid state realized it needed, in some cases, a settled black population to provide more skilled labor, they developed this dual system of habitation. Okay. So this is an example of a black township that is again organized according to a panopticon logic. So from the center, you can see down every street. The streets are very wide. They're made for easy policing by large military vehicles. So the apartheid state would send, effectively, I mean, they look sort of like tanks, but with tires, down these streets so they could easily surveil everything that was going on and attack any protesters. This gives you another example of a black township under apartheid. Again, wide streets, big separation, radial construction, easy policing. Okay. So I was saying earlier that this system was intentionally constructed by colonizers, and this gives you an example. This is a quote from an apartheid leader in 1905. If we allow Africans to live in urban areas, for a time, the townships will consist of able-bodied people. But they grow older, they become ill, they become disabled. Who's going to support them? The state didn't want to support them. They commit offenses. Who is to control them? We don't want to police them, right? So the reserve, by contrast, is a sanatorium where we can recruit workers. If they are disabled, they remain there. Their own tribal system keeps them under discipline, and if they become criminals, there is not the slightest difficulty in bringing them to justice because they're controlled by the local authority. So all of this would absolutely without cost to the white community. I mean, think about how intentional this logic is, right? This is from 1967. An interesting year. So this is from the Secretary of Bantu Administration. It is accepted government policy that the Bantu are only temporarily resident in the European areas of the Republic, temporarily resident, for as long as they offer their labor there. As soon as they become no longer fit to work or superfluous to the labor market, they are expected to return to the reserves. No stone is to be left unturned to achieve the settlement in reserves of non-productive Bantu at their present that are presently residing in European areas. Okay. So it gives you a sense for how serious they were about this labor question. Okay. Right. Okay, so to sum up what I've said so far, the system of reserves and indirect rule offered more efficient political control and a way to divide the black population by ethnicity so as to prevent some kind of unified rebellion. Right? At the same time, this internal migration system provided enormous economic benefit in the form of very cheap labor. Okay, so that's kind of what I'm trying to say is the key logic of grand apartheid that I think we need to be focusing on here. Okay, but of course there was another crucial step in the development of this logic. When the National Party came to power in 1948, is everybody all right? When the apartheid National Party came to power in 1948, they sought to transform the native reserves into entirely independent states, okay, or Bantustans. So it's crucial, the switch from the word native to the word Bantu is so important here because the word native was problematic for the apartheid state because it suggested that they have some claim to indigeneity, right? So they shifted from native to Bantu as a way of avoiding that legal claim. So the goal of the Bantustan movement was that the state would divest itself of all responsibility for the management and welfare of the majority black population. Okay, so Africans would gain citizenship in the new Bantustans, in these new states, but they would permanently lose the possibility of citizenship and any voting rights in South Africa itself, okay, as the broader territory. So this would allow the white population to govern with a democratic majority within South Africa, while still making use of black workers as immigrant labor, technically immigrant labor from different nations suddenly, okay? So no responsibility whatsoever for them. So we can think of this as the multi-state solution in South Africa, if we want this comparison with the Palestinian case. So the South African state peddled this as a liberal intervention, emphasizing that the state would grant self-determination and self-government to the Bantustans as a form of decolonization. This is how it was branded. Remember, during this time, the 50s and 60s, decolonization was happening all around Africa. And so the apartheid state knew this was going to be an effective force against them, and they said, look, we're also going to decolonize. And the Bantustan strategy was their solution. Okay. Right, so, this is a small sampling of some of the laws that were brought in to make the Bantustans legally possible. So the first one, the Bantu Authorities Act in 1951, was the very first step towards self-government. Look at the third one, the Bantu Homeland Citizenship Act in 1970 transferred African citizenship from South Africa to the reserves. But there's a whole slew of laws that made this legally possible. So the Transkei, which, if we go back to this map here, is one of the bottom right Bantustans. The Transkei, which is the largest of the reserves, was the first Bantustan to become nominally independent. Maybe you remember that, actually, if you're old enough. And it was later followed by the Ciskei, just below it, Bophuthatswana, and Venda. So the other 6 reserves never gained full national independence, but they had various degrees of self-government. Okay. So these new independent states were born with all the trappings of a new independent nation. Okay, with all the trappings of nationalism. So this gives an example in Transkei of the flag that they were given, and they were also given a coat of arms. This is the Ciskei, also given a flag. Totally arbitrarily. And also given a coat of arms. They had flags, national anthems, embassies, ambassadors, limousines, all of the beautiful sort of performative attractions of independence. And there were big official independence ceremonies held with other foreign states, heads invited to the celebrations, etc. A kind of bizarre performance of black liberation. And the Bantustans also had their own parliaments, and so they could claim to be democracies. Okay, and so, anyways, right. So I want to emphasize that this was the crowning achievement of a long history of indirect rule under colonialism. Right. This was its ultimate agenda, its ultimate goal. It was a much more effective form of government because it prevented the resistance that would come with direct oppression. It was much less expensive, and you had the added benefit of cheap labor without having to pay any welfare benefits at all. And also you avoided, again, unified race consciousness that would emerge from a unified black population. Now, okay, so the leaders of the Bantustans were happy to go along with this plan. And I'm sure you can imagine why, because they and the local elite they accumulated unprecedented new powers and wealth. Okay? Suddenly they felt that they were like presidents on the international stage, and they had access to the treasury. There was rampant corruption in these new governments, etc. And that's basically exactly what the apartheid state wanted, was to kind of buy out this Bantustan elite. You can come in if you want to. But of course, most Africans rejected this plan, the Bantustan plan. And to many international observers, this appeared very confusing because they would say, why would the Africans not want, I mean, if you weren't following the story, you wouldn't know. Why would the Africans not want independence? You could be easily tricked. So the anti-Bantustan movement seemed almost anti-independent. You have no idea why they would want that. Didn't make any sense. But of course, the reason is that Africans saw behind the ploy of indirect rule that this was materialism. They realized that independence would mean forever relinquishing their rights to the lands from which they had been evicted in the first place, right? So they would lose control over their traditional homeland, the entirety of South Africa. It would also sort of permanently divide the black population into these arbitrary ethnic camps. And they realized that independence would be little more than an illusion, because the Bantustans would have no sovereignty over their own borders. They would have no control over security. They would have no control over foreign policy. And another key issue is that South Africa would retain control over water resources. Really interesting analogy here as well. So in no way were they sort of meaningfully sovereign. That was not really a possibility. And also the Bantustans in many cases were too poor and fragmented to be self-sustaining in any economic way. So they would continue to rely on remittances from labor in South Africa, right? But this time, they would have no claim to the rights of citizenship in South Africa whatsoever. Okay. Now this is interesting. So I'm from the country of Swaziland, which you can see there. Now Swaziland is effectively a Bantustan, but it's an independent country. It gained its independence in 1968. Today, when you think of Swaziland, you think of it as an independent country. But again, it's effectively Bantustan because the majority, something like 30 to 50% of the population, the working population, works as migrant laborers in South Africa. So it still basically operates as a labor reserve for South Africa. Okay. Now it's an extremely poor country, but because it's independent, poverty is considered to be a problem of national policies somehow, and its exploitative relationship with South Africa is erased, and so therefore. The poverty of Swaziland becomes the insignia of the symbol of its moral failure somehow, as though Swaziland is poor because they're uneducated or whatever it might be, as opposed to being an oppressed people. Okay, so effectively, independence in this case depoliticizes the problem of poverty. It takes it out of the question of power. Of course there was resistance against the Bantustan system. This is Steve Biko, he was a black consciousness leader, I'm sure you know of him. He called the Bantustans the greatest single fraud ever invented by white politicians, which is saying quite a lot because white politicians are very good at fraud. So he says, these tribal cocoons called homelands are nothing else but sophisticated concentration camps where black people are allowed to suffer peacefully. We black people should all the time keep in mind that South Africa is our country and that all of it belongs to us. The arrogance that makes white people travel all the way from Europe to come and balkanize our country and shift us around has to be destroyed. Whereas whites were mere guests to us on their arrival in this country, they have now pushed us out to a 13% corner of the land and are acting as bad hosts in the rest of the country. This we must put right, down with the Bantustans. So this was very powerful rhetoric coming from key figures like Steve Biko, who was later assassinated for this kind of resistance. Resistance against the Bantustan strategy was the most feared form of resistance under apartheid. Okay? It was the most effective and also the most feared. Right. So a few things to understand about the Bantustan system is that they collaborated very intimately with the apartheid state, with the apartheid security system. So Bantustan security forces were required to repress anti-colonial protests within their territory. And any dissent within the Bantustans, they were supposed to repress in service of the apartheid security system. So they were effectively like subcontractors for the colonial occupation. So South Africa would give lists of names to the Bantustan authorities with agitators, and then they would be arrested and many times tortured. The first use of torture was against people who resisted the Bantustan authorities. The first recorded use of torture in South Africa. Right. So, and of course the Bantustan authorities were instrumental in suppressing the African National Congress. Any form of unified black consciousness in South Africa was very dangerous to the apartheid system, and the Bantustan authorities were the front line in pushing against that. So as a result, there were widespread revolts against the Bantustan authorities. Okay, and this is a part of South African history that we all too easily forget. In fact, again, the most effective form of resistance against apartheid was against the Bantustan authorities, and in many cases, it was very well organized. So they would burn Bantustan authority houses. They would destroy their property, they would slaughter their cattle. They would chase them out of their communities. They organized strikes and boycotts against the Bantustan authority system. They would very viciously punish collaborators, okay? Including black police, parliamentarians in the Bantustans, and especially informers who were often burned alive. Okay, so these tactics, of course, they're highly controversial, very violent, of course, but the stance itself was not. It was a matter of life and death for the anti-colonial struggle. Self-government was regarded as a form of colonialism that had to be resisted at all costs, even if it meant burning your neighbor's house, right? Okay, so again, the South African state deeply feared this resistance, and they would make incursions into the Bantustans to suppress it. In one very famous incursion in the 50s, they killed 280 protesters in one incursion. They arrested 5,000 people in one mass arrest. They sentenced 30 people to death, and they tortured 150 people. This is in one single incursion, and many similar incursions were made. I want to give this image to you. This is an amazing image, I think, of the role of women in resisting Bantustan authorities. You see the Bantustan authorities on the right, dressed as police, and the women confronting them, wielding sticks. So women were very powerful in the struggle against the Bantustan authorities, because they were the ones mostly left at home, right, to deal with these collaborators. Okay, so it's important to understand that, of course, as you know, eventually the international community rejected the Bantustan strategy, except for one state, and that was the state of Israel, which was the only state to recognize the legitimacy of the Bantustans, and in fact invested heavily in Bantustan economic development and security services, okay? Because they knew they wanted to use the exact same strategy in Israel, so they should try to make it work. Okay, so hopefully this view of the logic of apartheid and resistance against that logic helps give some meaning to the apartheid analogy in the case of Palestine. So apartheid was about legalized discrimination, yes. It was also about settler colonialism and forced displacement. Yes, these are familiar to us. But the deep logic of grand apartheid was first and foremost about indirect rule, okay, which yielded, again, significant political and economic benefits for the white minority. And so it's in the case of indirect rule that I think the apartheid analogy actually has the most traction in the case of Israel-Palestine. So I think this helps us think in new ways about this analogy, about what's happening here. I'm not an expert, so maybe this is something that best happens in conversation afterwards, but we can look at Israel's land grabs during the Nakba and the Naksa. The process of claiming, the best, most resource-rich lands. This is all very familiar to the South African case as well. The forced removal of Palestinian families. And then also Israel's strategy of claiming to be a democracy, which only, of course, works by externalizing the majority Arab vote, okay, which is exactly the strategy that was used by South Africa. And then, of course, the process of using the Oslo Agreement to create a Palestinian authority, to create the West Bank as a self-governing territory. So effectively using the Palestinian Authority as a form of indirect rule. Okay. So of course, to casual observers, and I think probably to most people in the West, the idea of Palestinian self-government and statehood seems to be a good thing. This unilateral declaration of statehood seems to be a good thing. But for South Africans who view this process in light of the history of apartheid, the academic consensus is very much in the opposite direction. And this is not to say that this is necessarily correct. I mean, this is a conversation we have to have here separately, but this is the perspective of South African academics. Because effectively they see it as a form of indirect rule, allowing Israel to outsource the everyday business of occupation to an indigenous authority that carries more legitimacy than the Israeli military does. And of course the shift toward independent statehood neutralizes Palestinians' claims to the right of return and to equal citizenship in historic Palestine. Okay? So these are the risks that South Africans are perceiving in this process. So, and of course, this is exactly why the Palestinian resistance organizations rejected the notion of self-government in the 1970s. Okay? They could see how clearly it mimicked the Bantustans strategy in South Africa, which was unfolding at exactly the same time in history. It was very proximate to them, and so this analogy was powerful. Okay. So I'm just going to give you some ideas of what people in South Africa are talking about when they think about the apartheid analogy. So people who follow the Palestine case. So we know, of course, that just like in the Bantustans, the PA elite has benefited tremendously from self-government. Okay, and we know that there's overt security collaboration between Israel and the PA. The 2003 roadmap explicitly says that the PA should arrest subversives on behalf of Israel. We know that Israel gives lists of names to the PA in exactly the same way that happened in Bantustans. So for these reasons, academics are typically against the two-state solution in South Africa. But there are many ways that the analogy doesn't exactly apply because Israel has managed to learn from South Africa's mistakes. So first of all, South Africa made the mistake of directly picking Bantustan leaders, okay, which undermined their legitimacy from the start. There was no way you could say this is a legitimate ruler because they were picked by South Africa. So whereas Israel has supported the elections, which give the authority much more legitimacy. And also, in South Africa, the state unilaterally declared the Bantustans to be independent states, which of course made it all too obvious from the start that this was a farce. Why would South Africa want to do that? Because it was in its own interests, okay? So whereas Israel has allowed the PA to claim statehood for themselves, so South African academics like Virginia Tilley have been pointing out that this is basically them walking into a trap set for them. And the idea that Israel is against the idea of Palestinian statehood is a farce made to make it seem as though they don't support it. But there's also the question of labor, and this is again back to my area of expertise, I guess. And I think this is an important point. So in South Africa, but I'm keen to hear what Ethan has to say afterwards. So in South Africa, the fact that the white economy relied so heavily on black labor was a major weakness of the apartheid system, because Africans were able to organize very powerful labor unions. And in fact, the unions were aided, the organizations were aided by the fact that workers lived in these hostels. So they're very easy to organize. You send one organizer to the hostel and everybody's organized immediately. So that helps quite a lot. And when these unions began to strike, this was a key tool in undermining the regime. So the unions became the backbone of resistance against apartheid. And what's important here is that the South African business community originally supported the reserve system on the basis that it granted them really cheap labor and very high profits. But as soon as the strikes became a threat to business, the business community became anti-apartheid. Okay, and it was because of that was a major force in the downfall of apartheid. Okay, when white businesses turned against the state. So the downfall of apartheid was only possible because of the system's reliance on black labor. Now Israel recognized this weakness. Okay, so in the 1990s, exactly when in the early 1990s, 1993, exactly when the apartheid state was collapsing because of labor pressure, the Israeli state began to make a massive effort to reduce its dependence on Palestinian labor. Okay, so in 1992-93, I want to say that 33% of the workforce in Israel was Palestinian, right? And then a year later, it was down to 6%. I mean, an intentional effort to rid themselves of Palestinian labor and replace that labor with migrant workers from other countries. And of course, this was aided by the fact that Israel was able to make use of globalization to become like a high-tech economy that exported financial capital effectively. So this basically destroyed the power of Palestinian unions in Israel. And the problem with this is that it makes it much more difficult to deploy the same strategies of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, because you don't have this unified bloc. Now, of course, of unions. Now, of course, Israel does still make use of Palestinian labor, but it's technically illegal labor in many cases, right? So there are places in the wall that are intentionally left open so that workers can slide through and then work very, very cheaply. But of course, they can't unionize as illegal workers because they're very vulnerable, and so they can make use of Palestinian labor for extra cheap, but without the risk of possible unionization. And then I guess the final point is that whereas eventually the business community in South Africa rejected apartheid, the same is not true in Israel, where the business community very powerfully supports the government because of its free market policies. So in those ways, I think the apartheid analogy breaks down a little bit, but we can think about that a bit more. So I guess I'll leave it there. We can chat.